Hi, great to have you here.
It's so great to see you. Woo! And I love that the room is buzzing already with excitement. We want to keep that excitement going. I'm Laur Hesse-Fischer. I run MIT's Climate Change Engagement Program.
I'm Aaron Kroll. I'm the managing editor for the Climate Change Engagement Program. And during this breakout, we are going to be running some little polls. So I would love you all to point at this QR code right now and just set up this app so you're ready to give us some answers. And while you're doing that, please also turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself. Just say a little bit about what you're hoping to get out of this session. Go ahead.
Eager crowd.
Yeah, energy.
All right, please come back.
All right.
Please come back. All right, now you have a bit of a sense of the other people in the room and also what you and other folks are trying to get out of today's session. We look forward to hearing more about that. So MIT started this program because as an institute, we have a commitment to share our knowledge about climate change with the world. And we get that climate change is confusing. There is a lot of information out there. It's hard to know where to get started. It's hard to know what and who to trust. So what we're doing with our climate change engagement program is trying to be the signal through the noise of climate change. And Aaron's going to tell you about the different ways that we do that.
So we have a few flagship things we put out there online. We have the MIT Climate Primer, which is sort of the 101 of climate science. We have our climate portal, climate.mit.edu, where you can find some quick written material to help you get smart quick on climate change. That includes short explainers, jargon-free, nonpartisan, from a scientific perspective, on everything from solar energy to sea level rise, as well as a series called Ask MIT Climate, where people write into us from around the world with their questions about climate change, and we get them answered with help from experts at MIT and around the world.
We also run a podcast called Today I Learned Climate, or TIL Climate. You can find it anywhere that you download your podcasts. And I'm the host, and Aaron writes the show. And you'll be hearing my voice when we air little clips from the podcast. So not to give you too much cognitive dissonance, but that is going to be me.
And for this breakout, what we are going to do is just share with you 4 questions that we have answered through all these different programs. And we're hoping that you'll learn some interesting things about climate change, some things that we found really opened up climate change to us and helped us understand the problem and its solutions better, as well as some of the tips that we have for how to communicate these things and how to make them approachable. And I'm going to start with a question about disasters, because when your job is to teach people about climate change, there's no getting around talking about some really scary stuff. People being displaced from their homes is scary. Food and water shortages are scary. And if we're going to be honest communicators about this, we have to say that what we're seeing now is actually just the beginning. And as long as we keep putting CO2 into the atmosphere, the problems are going to keep getting worse. And yet, we want to leave people with a sense of hope and a sense of empowerment that they can do something, that we all can do something to deal with these, short of solving the entire problem of climate change, along the way to solving the entire problem of climate change. And fortunately, that is also the truth. There is a lot that we can do right now, and there's maybe no better example of that than this first question. Why are wildfires getting worse? For those of you who are actually from Seattle, this is a problem you're very familiar with. Wildfire season is getting much more intense. And even if you never see a fire up close, throughout the summer, the smoke has become an unignorable and frightening part of life. And if you're here in this room, you don't need me to tell you that climate change is behind this, but the details of how and why are actually pretty interesting, and I want to start here. How many of you, show of hands in the room, think that the number of wildfires in the US has risen in the last 40 years? Do we have more wildfires than we did in the 1980s? I am seeing a certain consensus in the room. You are wrong. The number of wildfires is actually flat or declining. And yet, we can all see that wildfire season is getting worse. So what's actually going on here? Well, I want to show this same data in a slightly different way. It's the character of wildfire that's changing. And you can see this in data like this, in the number of acres burned, but also in all sorts of different ways that scientists have tried to measure wildfires, like how hot do they get? How fast do they travel? How much smoke do they produce? How many structures do they destroy? The character of wildfire is changing. Now, for our podcast, we talked to Dr. Daniel Swain about this. He's a climate scientist at UCLA and the Nature Conservancy. And he told us that when it comes to wildfires, the rise in global temperatures only matters actually in a kind of roundabout way. Here's a clip from the podcast.
So the number one thing that's happening when it comes to climate change and wildfires is that the water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases rapidly with warming. So in other words, a warmer atmosphere holds more water.
Well, wait. More water in the atmosphere must mean more rain and snow, right? So shouldn't that help prevent wildfires? Well, yes and no. On average, the world is seeing more rain. Even a wildfire-prone place like California is experiencing bigger rainstorms than it used to. But the thing is, all that water has to come from somewhere.
So essentially, as the atmosphere warms, it becomes thirstier. And so this progressively larger atmospheric sponge, if you will, extracts more water out of the landscape, out of the soil, out of plants, leading to drier vegetation, and therefore both more liable to burn and also, and this is critical, more likely to burn at a higher intensity.
A warmer atmosphere holds more water. Who here knew that? Anyone? Yeah, a few of you. I didn't. But it actually ties together a lot of different climate impacts that we're seeing. Like, you might be confused about how we can simultaneously have a problem of worse flooding and worse drought. It's because of this greater holding capacity for water in the atmosphere. It causes rain to come in boom and bust cycles, where even a place like California that is actually seeing higher average annual rainfall is also seeing longer and more intense droughts, and that's being repeated around the world. This also, and this is why the atmospheric sponge that Dr. Swain talked about is a really useful metaphor, because what does a sponge do? It soaks up all the water you expose it to, and then you squeeze it out and all the water comes back down. It soaks up more water out of the land, creating a land that is more likely to burn, and then dropping it again. This also explains a little bit about why heat waves are getting more intense. Definitely temperatures are rising, but also we have more humid hot days, and when it's humid out, the human body has more trouble cooling itself by sweating, and these heat waves become more dangerous. And of course, it also helps explain wildfires. Imagine you have a very rainy spring. A lot of vegetation grows in, nice and thick and lush, and then fire season comes along, there's an extended drought, all that vegetation dries out, and now you've got more fuel on the ground to burn. So this is why climate change is making wildfires more intense. But it's actually not the only thing that's going on. Because just like flooding is going to be worse if we don't improve our storm drain systems, if we don't prepare our embankments to deal with more rainfall, wildfires are getting worse because we have had a dysfunctional relationship with the wild spaces where fires occur. Because wildfire is actually an important part of the natural environment. It clears out dead plant matter. It helps to remove some of this fuel from the ground. It also creates habitat for certain plants and animals. Some plants actually need fire to germinate, and yet, for roughly the past century, the US and a lot of countries around the world have had a policy of trying to quash every single fire that comes along. In fact, for 40 years, from the 30s into the 70s, the U.S. Forest Service actually had a policy that every fire that they found should be out by 10 a.m. the next day. Well, what happens to a forest that never experiences any fire for 40, 50, 60 years? Old plant matter dies. It falls to the ground. It builds up. Leaves build up. Branches build up. Dead trees build up. They produce more fuel. At the same time, more small and medium trees spring up, not just the old survivors that have been through rounds of wildfire, and you actually get thick, lush canopy at every level of the forest. It's a ladder that a fire can climb to spread faster. And when that lightning strike comes along, when there's a human accident that causes a fire, you get a much bigger and more dangerous fire, which is why one tool we have to protect ourselves from fire is actually to set some fires. Prescribed burning is when we choose the time and place when a fire is going to happen, make sure we are ready to control it, and clear out some of that foliage before an accidental wildfire comes along and rages out of control. And this is really a perspective that we could stand to bring to a lot of the impacts of climate change, because we are going to be living with more disaster, but we can live with it better. We can do a better job of preparing, of protecting ourselves, of lessening the risks as we work on the big picture problem of our warming planet. And I'm going to leave you with just a few more words from Dr. Swain.
There really isn't a no fire option. I think the consensus among fire and climate communities these days is that there is no way to not see more fire in the landscape in a warming climate. The real question is, do we want to see more of the catastrophic fires that we've recently been seeing, or are we willing to embrace seeing more fire on the landscape in the form of prescribed burning, cultural burning, these fires that are, yes, they're still going to produce some smoke, but they're going to produce less smoke and at more opportune times? That's the kind of choice that we potentially have. And I think that that's actually an optimistic thing, because those are two very different options, and we do have some control over which option we choose.
That's how we were able to end an episode on wildfires and have it still be uplifting and optimistic conversation. Okay, we are on to question number 2. How much carbon does the Earth naturally absorb? Kind of a wonky question, but what we found as we were wrestling with how to answer it is that it actually gives us an opportunity to distill something as complex as the carbon cycle into something memorable, simple, and potentially a transformative way of looking at the dilemma that we're facing with burning fossil fuels. Now, we can't take it for granted that people actually understand that the Earth absorbs carbon, right? I mean, not everybody remembers their science ecology class from high school. So we got to start with explaining somehow the carbon cycle. But the carbon cycle is really, really complicated. And in the TIO climate, we only have about 10 minutes, or if you're reading online, we have maybe 5 minutes of your attention to try to explain this. So here's how we tackled it. We did 2 different things. 1, we mapped the carbon cycle onto something that people already understood. And 2, we picked out one element that was most illustrative of our point. So let's walk through some of that right now. What we mapped the carbon cycle onto was the water cycle. We're all familiar with the water cycle, right? You know, it rains, water goes into aquifers under the ground or collects in the ocean, rivers, streams, and then evaporates and goes back up into the atmosphere. Well, the carbon cycle works in a kind of similar way. There's CO2 in the atmosphere. Plants absorb that, take the carbon, build themselves up. Those plants are the animals that eat them, die, and that carbon gets re-emitted back into the atmosphere. So, okay, once our audience understands basically how the carbon cycle works, and that, yeah, the Earth does, in fact, absorb carbon, we can actually get to answering our reader's question. So how much CO2 does the Earth naturally absorb every year? There is actually an estimate on this. I'm not going to ask you to guess it. It's 400 billion tons, which is a pretty meaningless number for me, and maybe for you as well. Like, what does that mean? What's 400 billion tons? Well, for the fun of it, let's try and visualize that, okay? So someone actually calculated or estimated that the weight of every building in New York City is 750 million tons. So the Earth's carbon cycle, how much CO2 the Earth absorbs every year, would be the weight equivalent of 500 New York cities. Gives you a sense of scale, right? Still a little bit meaningless, but it gives you a sense of scale. Okay. Which then, one of the things that we do in all the work that we do is we try to follow people on their lines of thought. So we think that the next question people are going to ask, once they understand how much CO2 the Earth absorbs, is, well, how does that compare to how much human activity emits, right? Couldn't the Earth just kind of reabsorb the stuff that we put up there? So to start answering that question, we are going to do a little poll. So what is your guess about how much CO2 human activity emits every year? So do you think it's 1/10 of what the Earth absorbs? Do you think it's the same, equivalent? Do you think it's 2 times more than the Earth absorbs, or 10 times more? What do you think?
10.
Well, 10? Okay, someone put an extra thing in the poll. We're going to do this poll here. All right, 10 times more than the Earth absorbs is the leading number. Now you're all going to be influenced by what everybody else thinks. Some of you are going to be rogue and say, oh, it's the same as the Earth absorbs. Other of you are going to do something else. Okay. All right? So, okay, 10 times more than the Earth absorbs, 2 times more than the Earth absorbs. You ready for the answer? It's 10%. CO2 emissions from human activity is only 10% of the natural carbon cycle. So I can guess what your next question is going to be. Who has it? Someone want to say what your next question is? How can that matter? How can 10% matter? Won't the Earth just deal with that 10%? Why is it such a big deal? Well, to answer that question, we can go back to our comparison to the water cycle. And we can bring people's attention to the different speeds of the water cycle. Because, yeah, we have rain falling and rising up into clouds over the matter of days and weeks, and water accumulating in rivers and streams over hundreds, thousands of years. But we also have glaciers that form. And those glaciers can take hundreds of thousands and millions of years to form. And during that time, that water is locked up inside of those glaciers. Well, it's kind of similar with the carbon cycle as well. So we have we're all breathing out CO2 right now. It's going up into the atmosphere. Trees right now are absorbing carbon and then storing it inside of their bark. But then also at the same time, we have limestone being formed in the deep ocean, and coal subject to deep pressures, and the carbon is subject to deep pressures and high temperatures and formed over the course of millions of years. In fact, some of the coal that we're burning now has been there for 350 million years. That is a very slow part of the carbon cycle. Now, normally it would take, again, about millions of years for the carbon inside of that limestone and the carbon inside of that coal to be re-emitted into the atmosphere. But what we're doing is we're emitting it over the course of a couple hundred years, which means we are putting carbon from the slow cycle into the atmosphere faster than the Earth can naturally absorb it. And what does that mean? That means that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere. In fact, for the last 150 years or so, we have added about 1 trillion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. That's about double the annual carbon cycle. So, the thing is that when we open up this shortcut from the slow cycle to the fast cycle, there isn't a natural shortcut back. If we don't find a way to take that carbon that's accumulating in the atmosphere out, that it will literally be there for thousands of years, even after we stop emitting carbon dioxide. And this is the way that we illustrate the dilemma of burning fossil fuels without then putting that carbon back into the slow cycle. And speaking of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, Aaron's going to go to our next question.
Yeah. One thing we've noticed a lot when people send in questions is that a lot of people out there are looking for a sort of silver bullet for dealing with climate change. Because transforming our whole energy and transportation and agricultural systems sounds really hard. And people would like there to be some easy, simple, neat trick that means we don't have to do that. Like, for instance, could we build a bunch of machines that suck carbon dioxide out of the air and just pump it underground? Could we cover more of the Earth in snow and have that bright reflective surface beaming the sun's energy back out into space so it can't warm us? And the thing is, these might sound a little bit far-fetched, but they are not made up out of whole cloth. They're not absurd. They're not detached from reality. And we have found that a helpful way to answer these kinds of questions is to say, yes, and. Yeah, that is an approach to dealing with climate change. Let's walk you through what it would actually take. And by the time we have walked people through what it would actually take, these neat tricks don't sound so simple. And by far, the type of question like this that we get the most is, why don't we just plant a bunch of trees? Boy, do we get this question a lot. We get every flavor of it. We get the big picture, okay, how many trees would humanity have to plant to take back all the CO2 that we are putting into the atmosphere? We get the small scale, very practical version. I own a business. It puts 400 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere a year. How many trees should I plant to cancel out my impact? Well, when we decided to take on this question, the first thing we wanted to do is just give people an answer, right? A number. This many trees. We didn't necessarily think it would be a very realistic answer, but we wanted to be able to say, okay, 10 trillion trees is what you're talking about. But when we started talking to the experts who actually study this question, it turned out that it is not that simple. Because first of all, it really, really matters what kind of tree you're talking about. Not just the species, but where it is. What kind of soil is it in? How old is the tree? It doesn't matter just a little, it matters a lot. Like, here are two studies, just for an example, of different forest ecosystems in West Africa. One measured the carbon storage of koso trees in the savannas of Burkina Faso. The other measured the carbon storage of mangrove forests on the coasts of Gabon. Now, I'll spoil it for you, the mangrove forests held more carbon, but what I would like you to guess is how much more? What's the difference between a forest that doesn't store very much carbon and a forest that stores a lot of carbon? I'd like to see your answers. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, 10 or 20 times seem to be the most common guesses. Yep, that's probably what I would have guessed too. The answer is 100 times more. It matters so much what kinds of trees we're talking about and where. But all right, fine, we could have gotten around this. We could have said, okay, but let's talk about the US's emissions. How many trees would we have to plant of sort of a standard North American temperate forest, and they're youngish because we're just planting them. But it's, once again, not that simple. And the second reason is I want to turn your attention to the units of measurement in this question I just asked. How many tons of carbon per hectare do these trees store? Not per tree, per hectare, because that's the scale we're talking about to even begin to consider planting trees as a climate solution. And we realized early on that we really needed to pivot our readers and our listeners from thinking about planting trees to planting forests. We talked to Professor Charles Harvey at MIT about this. He studies peat forests in Indonesia. And he told us something that really changed my whole perspective on trees as a climate solution. Because I'd always imagined that when you plant a tree, it's kind of like a vacuum for CO2. You plant it, you turn it on, and it just sucks and sucks and sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere continually. And that is true for one tree. It's not true of a forest. Because when a forest is young, when you've just planted a new forest, all those trees are indeed sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere continually, using it to grow and grow and grow. But when a forest is fully mature, some of those trees are dying. The largest and oldest ones are dying. And they are releasing their carbon back into the atmosphere as they decompose, while the youngest ones are still growing. And in fact, in a mature forest, it likes to find an equilibrium with the atmosphere, where it is actually releasing as much CO2 as it's taking in. We thought hard about how to help our listeners visualize this. Here's a clip from our podcast.
One way to think about the terrestrial carbon cycle is that you've got this uptake and this release. And the system likes to find a state where the two are equal to each other. And a lot of mature forests are like that. Even though the trees are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that same amount of carbon is being released as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere.
So you could say that when a new forest begins to grow, it's like a huge vacuum cleaner for CO2, rapidly pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. But eventually, it becomes a mature forest, which is actually breathing out as much carbon as it's breathing in. At that point, it's more like a big vault, like a bank vault, for CO2. Trees make little CO2 deposits and withdrawals as they breathe in and out, but overall, the amount of CO2 in the vault stays the same, locked up and out of the atmosphere.
It changes how you think about forests as a climate solution, doesn't it? Because under the vacuum model, if I planted a grove of trees and they absorb 50 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere a year, then that's a sort of permanent offset that I have. I can put 50 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year from then on, and I'm at a clean slate. It balances out. But the truth is the vault. When I plant a new grove of trees, I have to think about how much carbon those trees are going to absorb from the atmosphere over their lifetime by the time they become a mature forest. And that is the one-time deposit into the vault that I get to make. And that is how much CO2 emissions that forest can actually offset. And once we've reached that maturity, we also have to protect that forest forever. Because if anything happens to it, if it gets logged, if it burns in a wildfire, if there's a beetle infestation, the vault is smashed. The carbon goes back into the atmosphere. All right, so all that said, we did finally give a numerical answer to this question. And I'm going to let you guys guess it. So the United States emits about 5.5 billion tons of CO2 every year. If we wanted to cancel out that 5.5 billion tons of CO2, we would want to plant a forest about the size of Rhode Island, the Seattle metro area, Florida, New Mexico. Guesses? All right. I see you guys are catching on to how I do these questions. Yeah, it's the big ones. It's one of the big ones. All right, I'm going to spoil it now. It's the size of New Mexico. Yeah. I mean, we don't have a spare New Mexico lying around. We're not talking about a few trees on the, shade trees on the sides of streets or in city parks. We are talking about displacing something else to put a forest there. Displacing agricultural land, mining land, suburbs, I don't know. But, enough to make up New Mexico. And that's for 1 year of America's carbon emissions. Imagine if our strategy for fighting climate change was every year we're going to plant a forest the size of New Mexico. Look, we love trees. We love planting trees. This is a real climate solution, and we should be doing it where it's practical, and we should especially be protecting the vaults that we already have around the Earth. But I think you can see now why this is not a silver bullet.
All right, we are on to our last question, and then we're going to open it up for conversation and Q&A. We got this one. How many wind turbines equal one nuclear power plant? And in asking this question and us attempting to answer it, we realized we had an opportunity to introduce what we call our energy toolbox metaphor. So we have lots of different ways to generate electricity, right? And each one of them has its own characteristics and its strengths and its weaknesses. And we can use this question and the comparison of nuclear and wind to try and highlight and grapple with some of those strengths and those weaknesses. All right, so nuclear and wind are both lower CO2 than coal is. How much lower? Quite a bit lower. And actually, they're both kind of equally lower. So both wind and nuclear are about 2% the CO2 as coal is to generate electricity. And you can see that nuclear and wind, both offshore and onshore, are roughly equal in terms of their carbon intensity. And this is actually taking into account also what we call the embodied emissions, which is a fancy term for all the things that go into creating that energy technology. So for nuclear, that would be the cement and the mining of the uranium. For wind, it would be mining of the steel, production of the steel, the transportation of the blades, and things like that. So you can kind of imagine that the next question then is, well, what's better? Okay, these are both good, low-carbon technologies. Which one should we invest in? What are the differences? So we're going to work on answering that question. So let's look at wind and nuclear. So both of them use a turbine to generate electricity. It's pretty interesting that most electricity is generated these days through something as simple as pushing a turbine around. You might be familiar that nuclear uses uranium, you do nuclear fission, that heats up the water, that creates steam, that pushes a turbine and generates electricity. And with wind, a bit simpler, wind runs through the turbines, generates electricity. But that's a bit about where the similarities between nuclear and wind, that's where the similarities between nuclear and wind end. As you can imagine or guess, or as you probably know, the electricity that one nuclear reactor can generate is a lot more than one wind turbine, right? So let's just look at the numbers of that. So one average nuclear reactor can generate about 900 megawatts of electricity. One wind turbine is about 3 megawatts. Okay, great. So everybody do your mental math and get out your calculators and figure out how many wind turbines will it take to generate as much electricity as nuclear. Okay, I see some people on their phones. All right, this is a trick question. Maybe most of you caught on to that. It is a trick question because we haven't covered all of the information that we need for you to actually answer that question. Because as we know, the wind doesn't always blow. And the sun doesn't always shine, right? That's why these are called variable or intermittent energy technologies. Conversely, nuclear is what we call firm or dispatchable. It uses a fuel, which means we can keep generating electricity as long as we have enough uranium to supply it. And it's the same with coal, and it's the same with natural gas and oil, right? Those take fuels. And what that means is that we get to choose when to power up and power down these energy sources, and not the wind, and not the sun. Okay. So nuclear can run pretty much all of the time. Once it's powered up, it usually isn't powered down. It runs at about what we call as a capacity factor of 93%. And wind, for the reasons that we mentioned, it's variable. The wind isn't always blowing. It's only 33%. So when we take all of this into consideration, we can actually start coming up with our number. And now's your chance to guess. How many wind turbines does it roughly take to generate as much electricity as a nuclear reactor? All right, let's start seeing coming in. We got 800 is the leading number here. All right, we got a smart crowd. I'm not as good as Aaron is tricking you. The number is 800. 800 onshore wind turbines for the average wind turbine that's being built today equals one nuclear reactor. Now, of course, if you have a wind farm with 800 turbines, one, that would be a very big farm, but also, if it's a really blustery period across your entire farm, then you're generating 3 times as much electricity as that nuclear power plant. And if it's still, especially for a period of days, then you're generating 0% of that nuclear power plant. And this variability, this intermittency, is the biggest challenge with bringing wind and solar as our main sources of electricity. It's just not reliable enough. And I imagine everybody here in the room has heard about storage, right? Energy storage, electricity storage. This is why storage is such an important piece of the mix. Because right now the grid can only hold about 30 to 40% of electricity from wind and solar before this variability thing kicks in and becomes a real problem for reliability. Of course, if we're able to take some of that electricity from really windy days, find a way to store it, and then use it on those less windy days, we can help solve that problem. But that does add significantly, at least right now, to the cost of these technologies. Okay, so our reader did not ask us this next question, but we figured we'd pose it anyway. How many solar panels do you think it would take to generate as much electricity as a nuclear reactor, taking into account its capacity factor as well, which we didn't talk about, but you'll just make some guesses. All right. All right, things are changing. The number up. All right, 100,000 is leading. Closely in second place is 1 million. The answer is closest to 10 million. It is 8.5 million solar panels, which might, remember we talked before about kind of leading with people's questions, and might get you start thinking like, well, where are we going to put all of those? Which is a really good question. So let's take a look at that. So let's look at 1 terawatt hour of electricity and the land use it would take. That's about powering 70,000 homes for a year. For nuclear, it'd be about 7 hectares. For wind and solar, it's a lot more. Wind, 12,000 hectares. Solar, 2,000 hectares. But of course, we know that you can put solar on rooftops and in parking garages. And wind, you can have agriculture happening beneath or cattle grazing. These are alternative uses for that land, right? So this is not me downplaying wind, okay? I think wind is an incredible technology, is absolutely one of the critical technologies we need to decarbonize our economy and decarbonize it quickly. But there's this thing called technological tribalism. There's a camp that is wind and solar and nothing else. And then there's another camp that's hydrogen and carbon capture and nuclear and not wind and solar. And if we can get beyond this technological tribalism, then we can have an honest conversation about the strengths and weaknesses of these different tools that we have in our toolbox and how to best optimize them to decarbonize as quickly as possible.
All right.
Great.
And with that, we'd love to open this up to your questions. And I'll say that if you have a question about climate change, climate science, climate solutions, you can ask us right now, and we'll do our best. We are communicators, not climate scientists, but we will do our best, and we have learned a lot.
Usually we research and fact-check this stuff.
Yeah. So you can also send us your questions about climate science and solutions to climate.mit.edu/ask, and we might answer it for our series. In the meantime, today, we would really love your questions about the work we do, what we've just shown you, what you think is interesting.
Face.
Yeah. So let's get started, and just raise your hands. There will be people around the room running mics to folks.
Thank you. That was a really illuminating discussion. I didn't know a lot of that, even though I work in climate, so definitely worth attending. Speaking of researching and fact-checking, what are your favorite sources? I mean, there were so many numbers and so much data, and it's like comparing apples to oranges a million times. So where do you turn to get all this, and how do you know you can trust these numbers?
Yeah, great question. So number one, we do not publish anything without working with a subject matter expert. They read the pieces before publication. Often they are actually our co-authors. They listen to the episodes before publication. So we do have that layer of professional fact-checking, as well as employing an actual fact-checker. But in terms of our sort of like go-to sources, obviously it matters what we're talking about. But the International Energy Agency is fantastic. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are very, very good, although very hard to read. The U.S. Energy Information Administration gives a lot of statistics that are super, super valuable and tracks a lot of different stuff about our energy system closely. So those are a few go-tos for me.
Can you start with your name and...
Oh yeah, could you please share your name and what you do?
My name's Michael. I work in climate change communications.
Oh, great.
Terrific.
Michael
Yeah.
on climate
Start with
communications.
name and company.
Nice.
Hey, thanks for being here. My name's Becca, and I lead sustainability strategy for Starbucks in the CPGU business side, so down the grocery aisle. And I'm curious about some of the solutions that you didn't mention today that you're really inspired by. What are you looking toward to the future to say these are some of the solutions that this group should really be talking about and be interested in?
Well, there are a few areas where we need a lot of innovation and investment that could be game changers when we're talking about decarbonization. Energy storage is one of those. I mean, we really can't decarbonize in a major way unless we're figuring out a good way and a cheap way to store electricity when we have an abundance of it so we can use it later. And related to that, we have an issue with building clean energy in this country as well as transmitting it. You might have heard about permitting reform or transmission reform. These are really critical bottlenecks, not so much on the technology side, more on the policy side. And there is opportunity for bipartisan work in each of those areas. Some of that's happening now. We need a lot more of that. But that's really holding up a lot of the deployment of clean energy technology today. Something else that I also find personally inspiring is the work that's happening on nuclear. A lot of the nuclear that we're all familiar with is kind of old school nuclear compared to what's being built today, which has just like incredibly low amounts of waste, and even a lot of that can be recycled and reused. And these are small modular reactors. It's really exciting to see like the leapfrogging that has happened in this area and what could be possible coming up soon. Margaret, right behind you. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Winston Vaughn. I work with Clearloop. We're a renewable energy and carbon solutions provider that works in some of the highest carbon intensity parts of the U.S. grid. And actually, that was the root of my question as we're talking about the impact of nuclear versus solar and these other places. One of the key things about the United States is that the carbon intensity in different parts of the country can be very different from each other. And yet we measure emissions and scope 2 emissions in megawatts instead of pounds of carbon. And I'm wondering if you guys have looked at how to communicate the difference, the inequities in the U.S. electric grid and the impacts that has on carbon and on human health.
I think I might.
Yeah. No. I think we could do that. I know people that are dealing with this exact issue, and it's really complicated. There are people who are in the like 24/7 camp. There are people in the tons of CO2 camp, and they kind of fight with each other, right? And for people who have no idea what we're talking about, I understand that you have no idea what we're talking about. It has to do about where you generate your electricity from and what dirtier fuels you are displacing and what kind of matters, especially when it comes to supplying and like saying you're a net zero company and where you're getting your electricity from. But what's really exciting is that this is where the climate change rubber hits the road, right? Like people weren't thinking about this question 5-10 years ago, or maybe they were, but it wasn't quite at the level of urgency that exists right now. And it's a really exciting time, and the challenges around climate communication are quickly evolving. Like, let me give you one example. You hear about climate misinformation, disinformation, and people on the political right who don't believe in climate change, There's this kind of theoretical argument. But now what's happening is that wind and solar is coming to people's backyards, right? It's coming to their communities, it's coming to their farms, transmission lines are running through forests. And this is where we're starting to get confronted, communities are starting to get confronted with climate solutions. So there's a whole new wave of people that are Googling online and talking to their neighbors and looking for information about do wind turbines cause cancer, or that kind of stuff, but also really real questions like how many wind turbines does it take to, like, can't we just do a nuclear plant instead of having all these wind turbines like kind of take over? And this is actually a new breed of questions that we're getting into our platform, really looking at the tension between communities and folks and the deployment of clean energy solutions.
I do want to add a little bit to that, which is that, we really have seen this change in the 5 years we've been doing this work. Fewer questions about, isn't CO2 great because plants breathe it? And more about, I'm really worried that these wind turbines are going to kill all the birds. I think it's really important to engage with these questions because if people like us aren't giving honest answers to these questions, you're either going to get your information from people who are trying to skate over wind turbines kill birds, or people whose only interest in wind is we got to stop it all because it's killing all the birds. When in fact, there's some really helpful context. Yes, wind turbines do kill birds, and also if you're worried about bird deaths, it's 0.001% of the problem, and it is not necessarily better than burning a bunch of coal. It's important to have nonpartisan, science-based sources answering those kinds of questions because people have them more and more. seen a lot of hands.
Hi, my name is Brandy Clark-Burton with Eco Networking and also in Climate Communications. I wanted to go back to your presentation about talking about the vault idea about trees. That was a good metaphor for me. And it points to a bigger sort of question about carbon offsets. But my understanding is that a more mature tree is more valuable kept alive or protected. And so, like, can you speak about the trees in the stages of life and protection, and then as it relates to this effort to protect and put a value on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that a mature tree, a fully mature tree, is storing more carbon presently than a new one. And I guess if there were somehow a question of like, should we protect this mature forest or this one that was recently planted? Like, yes, you could have that sort of value discussion about the mature forest is the most important because it's storing the most. I guess I hope that situation is not coming up an awful lot of the time.
You could also talk about the accounting issue.
Yeah, I mean, the offsets is we did a podcast episode on offsets, and it's a really it's a really thorny area because there are a lot of accounting problems with like how do you even measure this? How are you sure that what you're measuring is accurate? Not even like the difficulty of putting a number on how much carbon is being stored here, but also like, if you protect this forest from logging, are you in fact going to just have loggers go log a different forest? So, like, I'm not militantly against offsets as a tool in the toolbox, but I would take with a really strong grain of salt the idea that you're getting the amount of carbon you're paying for if you're buying offsets. We rarely end an episode on a skeptical note about a climate solution, and this was an episode where we really kind of did. It's great that money is pouring in to climate solutions via offsets. I just would not trust the figures that are being connected with that.
We can send you other resources if you're interested.
Louis here. I also work around climate communications with a view to social media. I'm really intrigued as you think about audiences. I can imagine that as you're thinking about business leaders, policymakers, there's a use to giving them a lot of information. As you think about consumers and kind of the broader public, how much is too much? And is there a baseline of like, if we could just get everyone to know this, then we'd be okay?
The answer to your second question of if we could just get everyone to know this would be okay is no. Everyone has a different perspective. Everyone has different needs. Everyone has different questions. We really cater to what we call the climate curious. These are people who are Googling, looking, asking questions, or just want someone to kind of hold their hand and explain what the heck all these things even mean. And so we're focused on providing them with what they need so they can make informed decisions in their world. But we know that other folks need a totally different kind of approach. So we also run a journalism fellowship. And that's for people who are not Googling about climate change. We support journalists across the country in local newsrooms who want to connect climate change, science, and solutions with the important things that are happening on the ground in their communities already, the things that their communities are already thinking about and already concerned about. And we have journalists in Oregon and Wyoming and Montana and Kentucky and Tennessee and Texas and South Carolina. I mean, this isn't, we're kind of, we love Bloomberg. Bloomberg's doing great work, but we're not supporting Bloomberg journalists through this kind of thing. And the whole point is, one of the key parts of climate communications, as you well know, because I know a bit about your work, Louis, is trusted messengers, right? Who is telling you what you're being told? Do you trust them? Do they feel like that person is part of their tribe, that they understand you? Do they feel like other people in their community and network believe the same kinds of things? These sociological and psychological elements are really, really important. In fact, they're even sometimes more important than like getting the fact in particular right. That's a huge part of this. It makes way more difference for one policymaker to talk to another policymaker about climate change than for one policymaker to hear from an environmental advocate. So we know that MIT is a great trusted messenger for the climate curious. We also recognize that for some parts of the country, we're not the best messenger. And what's more important is the local voices telling local stories. Does that answer your question? And there's so much more to unpack there. It's one of my favorite subjects.
Hi, thank you for the amazing talk. I certainly learned a lot. My name's Jonathan Azoff. I'm an investor here in Seattle, focused on early stage climate tech businesses. We run a firm called Snowcap. My question is, I've been really amazed. First of all, I learned a lot from a data perspective, but I'm always amazed at how little data matters to certain people when it comes to rhetorical persuasion, getting them to care or engage. So I'm just curious, from a narrative side of things, are there maybe certain narrative bits or rhetorical bits that seem to work really well in your world for getting people to lean in or get curious about climate and climate innovation?
My first thought was the logic thing, but
yeah, that's true. Well, I was going to say, one thing that we really try to do is because our job is mostly answering questions, right? Even if it's not phrased as a question, when people are like just Googling for a simple explainer on something, they're really asking like, what is this? What's its role? While answering these questions, while providing this basic information, we do have a sort of little internal checkbox in our toolkit that is like, here are like 5 or 6 messages we really would like more people to understand about climate change, and which one can we pull out with each thing that we produce that's going to make sense and also reinforce this larger perspective on climate change that we can slip in with the data, with the answer. So for instance, that energy toolbox that Laur talked about is one of these. The fact that the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere now is going to be there for thousands of years is another one, because it really brings into perspective the urgency of dealing with climate change right now, like getting people away from thinking that this is a problem for future generations. We really do have a unique power to act now that people in the future will not. So we do have these rhetorical pieces that we do slip in again and again and again, matching the right one to the right information.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
I was really compelled by what you shared about the data bit. And what we find is that the data matters. You got to back it up. And we try not to introduce too many numbers because it can get overwhelming and confusing. What we really try to focus on is the logic. If we can help people understand the logic of it and help it match with their own logic, then I think that we can be quite effective in having them get some of this. Now, I mean, you can tell us how well we did today. But basically, we took the explainers and the Ask MIT Climates and the podcast episodes, and we selected 4 of them, and we really condensed them down to a couple of minutes for this presentation. But what we hope we did was walk you through with us the logic that we took and trying to follow your own logic train to lead you through something that was interesting and surprising. And then we put in some key parts of data that can really emphasize it and really kind of perk you up or get you to trust it to another level. So the logic bit, which we call inquiry-based learning and kind of traveling with people in their thought process, is an important part of it.
I feel like I just won the lottery here. Hi, I'm Kate Kurtz. I do sustainability work for the city of Seattle. One thing that we do at the city, or I think lots of municipal government folks all around the world do, is we try to influence behavior. We try to influence behavior change, and a lot of the reason for that is for climate. And one thing that we run into or sometimes worry about is if we lead with climate because it's a politically charged topic, will it have a backlash? And I'm talking about simple things like recycling, right? And I'm just wondering if you guys as communicators, if you have any suggestions.
I love this topic.
You're wrestling with a really, really challenging topic. And, we do have the benefit of writing for the climate curious. So we're not like, running headfirst into, well, if you even mention climate, it's going to be a turnoff.
So I'm just so sick of the word green. Like, I mean, sorry. But aren't you kind of? I mean, maybe it's just me here, but like, I'm so sick of it. I think because it's become this fad, right? It doesn't really mean anything. I mean, I call myself a greenie, like casually, so I'm not really sick of the word green. Like, I'm a greenie. It's a good shortcut. But I'm just like in the advertising and the messaging and do it to save the planet, like, ugh, I'm just so sick of that. And we don't use that. We don't use that kind of language. We don't use that kind of framework because we know it only fits for certain people. And like, what does that even really mean? Because when we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about saving the planet. We're talking about creating a livable future for humans and for life, right? It's not about saving the planet. I mean, sure, it's about clean air and clean water, of course, but we wouldn't do it if we weren't here. So appealing to that moral side of it, I mean, there are some studies that you see. You kind of see people do different advertising campaigns and like people are compelled by different things. And that's fine to a certain extent. And if people want to talk to me about that afterwards, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But most people, like, that's not durable, right? If you want people to recycle, you got to make it economically in their self-interest or easy or clear. It's got to be the default, right? And that's what's starting to happen now, and that's why the momentum right now is so exciting. Because what we're finding is that building more clean energy is starting to become the default. I mean, not completely. I don't want to shortcut. I mean, China's building a lot of coal. There's a lot of natural gas being built in the United States. But we're starting to see this shift happen, and it's really exciting. And that's not because folks are going green. That's because it makes good business sense. So the most that we can make it the default choice for people as opposed to appealing to this like additional thing that they have to worry and concern about, I think it'll be a lot easier to get people to do the kind of behavior we hope they can do.
Yeah. One of our key messages in our toolbox that we return to a lot is incentives matter. People are not going to take public transit if it's so much easier to drive a car. So, I think it is important to reach the most reachable people and have these sort of pioneers out there who are making their lives more sustainable, doing more, pro-climate things because they really value that a lot. I think reaching those people is great because the more you see it around you, the more it will seem like a reasonable choice. The more it will seem like perhaps the default choice. So that kind of communication is really important. But at the same time, you're not going to pull everybody along by saying this is the right thing to do. It really needs to be the easy thing to do, and that's a policy job and that's a technology job, and it's also a sort of like how do we build our own communities job. What do I want to fund in my local government kind of job. So.
We kind of talked about how we wouldn't both answer questions, but you can see how lit up we are by this question. So thanks, Kate. But another big issue here is that there's a lot of emphasis on the consumer when we don't make a lot of the decisions when it comes to climate and sustainability, right? How many different kinds of plastic are there out there? And how much of them are welded all together that they can't even be recyclable, or you're looking at it and you're like, oh, the top is recyclable, but the bottom isn't recyclable? Or, you go to Seattle and 1, 2, and 5 are recyclable, and then you go to Philadelphia and it's 1, 5, 3, 7. It's like, what does that even mean? So if we're really focused on just trying to shift the consumer without shifting the system that the consumer is a part of, it's a losing battle. And that's why whenever one of our other messages is when people ask us, like, what can I do about climate change? We say, yeah, okay, there's a lot that you can do. Like, I have an electric car. We electrified our house. We buy green electricity. Like, I've done all of that stuff. But really what I encourage people to do is think about what they can influence, because that's when we can start changing the system, right? If you're a part of a synagogue or a church or a mosque or some other group that has a building, right? How can you have that house of worship join other houses of worship and collectively purchase green electricity, right? Or how can you mobilize your congregants to write to your policymakers, right? And that's just one example. There are things you can do in business or inside of your community in other ways. And that's how we start changing these systems.
We have time for one more question.
I'm Bob Blake. I'm with a group called McClarty Associates, and we help companies, including green companies, sorry, Laur, overseas to expand their markets.
Okay, I'm a greenie, so.
But I have an international question. I was an American diplomat for 31 years, most recently ambassador to Indonesia. So I spent a lot of time talking about climate and green issues of various kinds. And the level of ignorance, I can tell you from living overseas my entire life in the developed world, is very high when it comes to climate and sustainability issues. And I had a simple question, which is, you mentioned your journalism training programs. I wondered if you'd be willing to partner with the State Department to do some training of international journalists, because that would make such a huge difference in a place like Indonesia, where there's so much disinformation and misinformation, and just getting some fact-based journalism out there would make a huge difference. And if you can do that, you can raise awareness, you can get the people to start really pushing their governments to do more. And for those of you who follow the NDCs around the world, only about a quarter of the planet, the countries that have NDCs, are actually in compliance with their own NDCs.
Those are their climate action plans and climate commitments.
Right. And part of that is because there's not a lot of pressure for them to do more. And so if you could do that, and if you don't mind, I'd like to put out on social media and things your thing for international people to pose questions.
Oh, you're going to broadcast our stuff on social media? Please don't, no.
You get a lot of crazy questions, that's the problem.
We already get lots of crazy questions.
and about 50% of our readership is actually international, although that's pretty concentrated in English-speaking countries, plus India.
But if you would be willing to think about doing some international training as well,
it sounds like a spectacularly powerful lever, especially because I think it's really interesting that the international scene, yes, there's less climate knowledge out there, but there's also much less climate resistance. The U.S. is really an outlier in how polarized this is. In other countries, where it's just a matter of raising the level of public knowledge, I say just as if that's easy. But you're not going to hit a wall, and people are actually more persuadable, and that shows up in polling and in sort of surveys and focus group work. So I think it sounds really powerful.
Great.
Climate@mit.edu is an email address that you can use to reach me and Aaron. It goes to both of us. I also have my card in a stack somewhere over there, and happy to talk with you afterwards about that idea. Thank you for mentioning that. Come on, we can take another one, right? Can we just keep going? I know you had already asked a question. Is there anyone?
You
a crazy one.
Yeah,
okay,
you seem to be burning up with it.
Last one this time.
Oh, bummer.
It's kind of Freakonomics-y, so I just want to see what you guys think. The first part is like kind of normal. What do you think of fusion energy? Is that a potential silver bullet? And presuming that fusion energy does happen, in 20 years, 30 years, whenever, on whatever time frame, are we going to have a ton of stranded assets? Every energy thing that we're building now is going to be a gigantic stranded asset, wind, solar, all of it. And what do we do with all that?
Oh, man. Yeah, I'll take this. First of all, such an exciting energy source. And we're at MIT, so maybe we're a little bit biased because we get to see it up close. It's one of the most advanced fusion programs in the world is a spin out from MIT. But I am very, very excited about fusion energy. I hope it's a big part of the future energy mix. Obviously, we should not gamble on that. And also, no, it's not a silver bullet. Because it's just like, imagine that tomorrow we flipped a switch and we heard that now there's a fusion power plant and it can generate more energy than it takes to heat up the fuel, and it's ready to be deployed. I mean, how long is it going to take to replace the world's energy system with all fusion, with something that needs to be able to scale up, to be modular, to be ready to set up a new one in every state and in every country? I hope there are more major energy breakthroughs. I'm excited about every single one I see. I love geothermal. That's a particular point of excitement for me right now. But I don't think that a new energy source we don't have yet is on its own going to be the answer to a clean energy system.
I mean, it would take decades and decades and decades for that to get deployed and completely clean our grid and everything.
Yeah.
I know. It's a bummer, isn't it? Don't you wish there were one? I would love it. I would love it if there were a silver bullet. Wouldn't we all? This has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Please track us down. We'd love to talk to you more.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
No. This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Every day, once a day, give yourself a present. Don't plan it, don't wait for it, just let it happen. It could be a new shirt at the men's store, a cat nap in your office chair, or 2 cups of good, hot, black coffee. Like this. It's the present. Like Christmas. Oh, man, that is the spot. Nothing like a great cup of black coffee.